Hello everybody, my name is Eli and today we are working on the second video for my spear project. In the last video we went over wood preparation, which was cutting it to its rough size and stabilizing it and getting it ready to actually cut out into the pieces that we're going to glue together. Well, in this video we are actually going to cut those pieces out as well as talk about the angles and the cut list and all of that good stuff. We're going to make a wedge sled to cut these pieces. It's going to be a permanent wedge sled. We'll get to that down the road. The first thing that I want to do is talk about where the ideas come from, because that's a question that I get asked a lot. And if I'm going to do a really detailed video on this project, then I need to cover everything, including where the idea came from. Some of you may know, some of you may not. I do countertops for a living, so I get to see a lot of images, pictures, and kitchens finished, and that's actually where I got the idea from. Is I came across the photo back in December of a finished kitchen, and above the island was 3 lights, and it was the lighting fixtures that gave me the idea for this project. The second I saw him, I knew I was going to do something with that idea. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go ahead and insert a picture of that lighting, and when we come back we're going to be at my other shop so that we can start this project off and cut out all the pieces. So here's that image where I got the actual idea from right now. Okay, so as you can see from the image that I just inserted in there, there's a set of 3 lights that hang above the island, and those lights are a spear shape, and those lights are made up of octagons. That particular shape, I didn't know it until I went and researched it. It's called a dodecahedron. So when I saw those lights, my first step was, I want to make a spear out of that. How do I do it? So obviously, like any person today, I went to Google, and I think I typed in spear made out of octagons, and it came up relatively quickly. And it actually took me to some mathematic forums and things like that. I don't know, I guess some people enjoy doing math on their free time. And I went into those groups and I asked the question, you know, how do I make a spear out of octagons? How do I figure the angles? I told them what I wanted to do, and they actually helped me work through the math. So I've actually seen the math up close, and if I were to post it, it's pages of math and angles and all this just crazy stuff. It's well beyond what I even want to spend my time trying to figure out, so luckily they helped me with it. The next step after that was deciding what woods that I wanted to use and things like that. Now the weird thing is, I went on YouTube like the next day, literally the next day, because I was checking on some things, and the first video on there as suggested videos was a guy making dodecahedrons out of plywood, and he didn't give any angles. It didn't matter, I already had them, but what he was doing was pretty cool. I kind of liked it. But the video was really incomplete as far as how do you make this thing. And what I noticed that he was doing is that he was building a dodecahedron, but he was doing it with 5 triangles to make up the octagon. So instead of just having 12 octagons with I think the degree was like 13 degrees or something, with a 13-degree back bevel on each of the 5 sides. I can't remember exactly, I'd have to go look. He was making it of 5 little triangles, and they were kind of concaved. So I went back to the mathematics forum, and they helped me figure out what those angles were. And a couple days later I'm on YouTube, and again, the first video on my suggested videos was another guy making the exact same thing. So if you ever wondered if your phone is paying attention to what you're looking at and what you're doing, I can pretty much guarantee it is, because At no point did I even think to go to YouTube to search something like that, but there it was popping up in my feed. Now, obviously this shape is not a unique shape. I spotted it used in lighting, and when I Googled it, it just popped up everywhere. There were dodecahedron lights and candle holders and, you know, all of that stuff. So the shape is not the unique part of this project. The shape was just the starting point for this project, which kind of, you know, we're going to get into that in just a couple of minutes. But so because I don't do drawings and stuff like that of my projects, I just kind of build it in my head. I kind of have to get used to drawing out these things so that people who want a more detailed description of what's going on, who want to kind of visually see what it is, will be able to do it. And that's actually why I'm standing in front of my panel saw right now, because I need a chalkboard so I can draw out everything and kind of explain it. And what I have here on this piece is in my iPhone, in the notes section, I have a list, and that list is this. If you guys, hopefully it can read. But basically what you see here is exactly what's in my iPhone. And I would build this entire project based off of this really short list. I don't need anything more than that. That's how I work. Because the way I visualize things, the way that I work, it's all in my head. It keeps me up at night, and for some odd reason, that's just how it works for me. So let me see if I can find I had a marker on me, so I can start drawing this out. Yep, there it is. All right, so we're going to go down this list, and I'm going to explain what's going on, and then we're going to go to the table saw, and we're going to start milling the wood and cutting pieces out. So this dodecahedron, as you can see on the first part of my list, is going to be 12 pentagons. Each pentagon is going to consist of 5 smaller triangles. So we're going to need a total of 60 triangles for each dodecahedron. Now, when I'm cutting out the wood, I don't know about you guys, but I always cut out more than I need. So if I'm going to do one of these dodecahedrons, I'm going to want to cut out at least 65 little triangles. Because if you lose one down the road, or one gets damaged, or who knows, whatever, then you're going to have to go back and try and replicate that missing triangle exactly to what the other triangles were, and that's a nightmare. In this case, I tried to mill enough wood to do 2 dodecahedrons, because I have ideas for each one of them to kind of make them different. So in this case, I'm going to need 120 to get the 2 shapes done. I'm going to shoot for 130. Okay, so back to where we were. We're going to be building a dodecahedron. If you were just building a standard dodecahedron, you would have 12 pentagons that you would just cut out of whatever wood you chose to use. And you would back bevel each of the 5 sides to create a sphere, but that's not what we're doing here. We are creating a dodecahedron, but the octagon itself is going to be more concave, and it's going to be made up of 5 little triangles. So I'm going to save everybody here the hassle of having to hunt down the math and figure all this out for yourself, and make it a lot easier. So what we need is 60 triangles. And I'm going to move this in actually so that you guys can see better what I'm doing. So sorry for the a rough camera movement here. Let me just get it adjusted so that everybody can see. There we go. So we're going to need 60 of these. We'll put a little note up here. 60 of these triangles. And if you take a look at my notes, this 56-degree triangle is right here in this corner. This angle, this is your flat surface, this angle here is 56, I think it's 56.2 degrees. Yeah. Okay. Same here. 56.2. So that's our triangle. Now, what we want to do to create this concave octagon for our dodecahedron is we're going to need a bevel on the bottom or another angle on the bottom, and we're going to need an angle on both sides in order to create that sphere. Well, the angle on the bottom is the angle that I have right here marked as base. So down at the bottom we're going to want an 8.95 degree angle on the bottom, and the two sides we're going to want a 13.12 degree angle. So we got a lot of complicated angles going on here. We've got a triangle, which is obviously angles, and we got compound angles, which come down off the back and the bottom and all of that. So the issue that you run into when you're cutting so many angles is that if your angle is off just a little bit, when you get around to that sphere, it's not going to line up really well. And even if your angles are really close, you're still going to have a little bit of play, or a little bit of your angles aren't going to match up. It doesn't matter how good you are, it's not going to be 100% perfect. But we want to get these angles as close as possible. So how are we going to do that? I'm going to come over here and we're going to talk about how we're going to make our first cuts. Now, sorry, I stepped away for just a second. When we stabilized the wood, my pieces of wood were 2 inches wide by about 5/8 of an inch thick. No, they were 3/8 of an inch thick, and they were random lengths because they were offcuts of larger projects. So we're going to have to mill those down, and we got to decide how big we want our sphere to be. In my mind, I'm looking to build roughly a 6-inch sphere. And what I'm going to do to get that 6-inch sphere is I'm going to make these triangles right here. They're not going to be that big, so they're going to be a little bit harder to work with. But the total height of these 60 triangles here for me is going to be 1 1/8 inch from top to bottom. Now, the reason that I want that is because obviously we're doing pentagons, and if my triangle is 1 1/8 from point to point, then my total, from here to here, I want my narrowest part to be just about 2 1/4 inches is what I'm getting at. And that'll keep the larger your triangle, you're going to have to basically double that, because that triangle is only half the width of your pentagon. So now we're going to move on to the cut list. Not the cut list, but how we're going to cut this out. So I'm holding in my hand one of the pieces of wood that I milled down. And this piece of wood right now, because I've already gone to the effort of milling them to the proper size, and I've already cut my 8.95 degree angles on there, because that's just the boring work and most of you know how to do it. And I'll still cover it on the table saw here in just a second. But you're going to cut your wood out to the size slightly oversized. In my case, what I did was, this is your board. Hopefully I'm drawing this so it makes sense. This is your board, and in my case, my board down here is 5 5/16 of an inch. It's 5/16 of an inch thick. And my total height right now, well, before I cut my angles, was 1 1/4 inch. It was slightly oversized. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be making, I think it's called a parallelogram. We're going to be ripping this board, we're going to be ripping an angle on each side, and that angle is going to be, hopefully you guys can see it, but this angle is going to be 8.95 degrees. And we're going to rip that on each side of this long piece of wood, and when we are done from this point to this point, I'm looking to have just over an inch and an eighth. So I'm looking to have roughly 1 3/16 for that, and that's what I've already done here. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go over to the table saw, and we're going to set it up for the angles, and we're going to start talking about how we're going to cut this thing out, and we're going to go from there. But before we do that, I want to talk about the design here for just a second and kind of get that out of the way. I'm a big fan of making things as unique to yourself as possible. I always struggle with making these videos, not because I'm worried about, you know, about the project itself, but because what I tend to see in the world of woodworking is that somebody does something that's great, in my opinion, and I really like it, and everybody jumps on the bandwagon and does that exact same thing, and it floods the market, and it kind of it takes away the uniqueness of that project or that person's work. Now, most shapes have already been done. If you can find a shape that hasn't been done, I would be extremely surprised. So what I'm talking about here is not the actual shape. What I'm talking about is what you do with the shape. And what I'm encouraging you guys to do is to take what I'm showing you and make it completely individual to yourself, because where I'm going with this, it's something that I've spent a lot of time on. I've thought about it. I've given it, you know, hours and hours, countless hours of restless nights, rolling around in bed, figuring things out, doing tests. This project actually started back in December, and I'm just now getting to the point where I'm cutting the wood. And this project has probably been built over and over 5 or 10 times inside of my head before I finally came to, this is what I'm going to do and this is how I'm going to do it. So what I'm saying is, I hope you guys enjoy this video, and I hope you guys actually set out to try and make one of these instead of just, you know, watching it be done. But if you set out to make one or anything like it, try and do it in a way that is individual to you, so that if somebody looks at it, they can say, oh, that's so-and-so's work, and not, oh, that's a copy of so-and-so's work. I think that where in the woodworking community there seems to be a big issue is just people want to replicate. They don't want to be unique and individual. And an example of that is the river tables. I saw a river table first about 3 years ago, and then I didn't see it, and then I started slowly seeing it more and more and more, and now everybody in the world is doing river tables. They all look the same. There's nothing individual about it. There's nothing wow about it. And in my opinion, it's just become cheap now. I would never, 3 years ago, I might have spent the money on a river table because it was unique. I might have even tried to make one. But now when I see it, it looks like, in my opinion, something you would buy at Walmart for $5, because I've seen so much of it. And the market has been flooded with it, that the uniqueness and the individuality of that project it's killed, it's done. And I'm even to the point now where I hope that that fad, which it is now, it's just a fad, I just kind of hope it goes away at this point, because it's been so overdone that it's just lost everything. It's the same thing with this is just my opinion, with the colored pencil turnings. when I first saw it, I was like, wow, and that's actually pretty cool, a vase made out of colored pencils. And I even had a couple friends, hey, can you make me one of these? And you know, I did, obviously. And now, because I see it literally everywhere, it doesn't hold the same value that it used to. So my point is, when you see projects or when you have an inspiration for something, try and make it as individual and as much to you as you possibly can. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the table saw and get these angles done. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start taking a look at these angles and start cutting them, and I'm going to go through how I did it. After you've decided on how tall you want each triangle to be, you're going to want to mill your blocks down, your blocks of wood, so that they're slightly oversized, which I've already done. And again, just for another reference, these are, at this point, 5/16 of an inch thick, random lengths. And right now, because I've already milled them to the proper size and cut the angles, they are exactly at 1 1/8 inches. But after you've cut your widths and everything, you're going to want to set your angle. Now, for this angle, we're going to want to cut, I hope you guys can see it, an angle on both sides of 8.95 degrees. Now, how I set that is I use a Wixie. And on my table saw, this Wixie doesn't really pick up 8.95 degrees. So what I have to do is I have to take 90 degrees, subtract 8.95 degrees from that, and it gives me 81.05 degrees. So I can set my blade to, I'm going to zero my Wixie, set it on there, tilt my blade to 81.05 degrees, and the Wixie's not going to give you that 0.5 degrees. It's just going to go 81.1, 81.2. So I usually set it to 81, and then I give it just a slight bit of a turn so that it doesn't quite go to 81, and that's close enough. You're never going to be perfect. So after I set my angle, I'm going to cut my pieces on both sides, and I'm using a brand new blade for this because I want my finished surface to be as smooth as possible. And I know you guys can't see that in the video, but what I ended up doing was I cut that 8.95 degrees on both sides of all my pieces of wood, and set them off to the side. Then I cut them again, and then I moved that fence in like a 32nd of an inch, and I ripped each side again, and then I moved it in a 32nd of an inch, and I ripped each side again. And what that did was, your first cut, when you're taking off more meat, your cut's not as smooth, but when you're taking off a 32nd of an inch and you run it through the table saw at a nice even rate, you guys probably can't see it, but the edge of this has no saw curves in it. It looks like it just came out of a joiner, really. And again, that's because I'm using a fine tooth blade, very sharp. This is a high quality, it's an Amana blade. I think it's 60 tooth. If I'm not mistaken, it might, you know what? Let me read it. This is an 80 tooth. But anyways, it's a super fine cut. So after we've cut all of those, we're going to move on. I'm going to go ahead, because that's, if you have any questions about that, just ask me in the questions below, and we'll go on beyond that. But now what we're going to do is we're going to set up to start cutting our triangles, and that's actually where it gets to be slightly more complicated. Okay, so at this point, what I've done is I've gone ahead and ripped all of these pieces of wood down. This is everything that I'm going to be using for my triangles. And I've got the 8.59 degree angle cut on both sides, and it's the right width. That's the easy part of this whole thing. That's why I didn't really get into showing you too much about cutting it, because these videos would last forever if I went through every single step. Again, if you have questions about any of this, I'll answer any of those questions in the comments below, and if you need a further video to show more detail about any of these processes, let me know, and I'll try and take care of that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move on to the actual complicated part of cutting these. Once we've got these cut to the right size, we need to start cutting. We need to start actually cutting our triangles, and our triangles are going to come out of these boards this way. They're going to kind of flip around as they go down the board. I can show you. I'll just draw on here, and hopefully it'll show up. So our triangles are basically going to be coming out like that as we go down this board. We're going to flip it over. In order to do that, we need to make a wedge sled. Now, what I did with this wedge sled is I've got an adjustable one that's sitting back in the corner. But because I'm probably going to do this project more than one time, I don't know how many times I'm going to do it, but obviously more than once, I wanted to make a permanent wedge sled set to exactly the angle that I want, so that this wedge sled will never change. I can just take it off the shelf and go to it. Obviously, I'll want to cut a practice piece before I, get too far into the project, just to make sure nothing has changed, but I doubt it will. I made this wedge sled out of 1-inch MDF, and the angle that you see here is 56.2 degrees. Am I holding that right? Yeah, I'm holding that right. It's 56.2 degrees. And what I did to get that angle was I used, I set my angle finder here on a flat surface. I zeroed it first, and I'll go ahead and turn it on. And I zeroed it first. I set it for 56.2 degrees, and then I laid it, and I made a mark on a piece of MDF, which I actually have here. And then I went to the chop saw, and I made a cut. I adjusted a little bit, made a cut, until when I set my angle finder on the table saw with that piece and hold it up there, it reads exactly. See, I've got some dust under there. It reads exactly 56.2 degrees, and there's no light between my edge and my piece of plywood, and that took a couple minutes to get that right. I had to make fine adjustments, and the reason why I cut a piece with such a long angle from point to point is if you're cutting a thin piece, you're not going to get as accurate of an angle as if you've got 6 inches from point to point. If you're trying to do like an inch, it may seem close, but the longer you can make this point, the more accurate your angles are going to be. I guess that's what I'm getting at. So on the chop saw, after I got done perfecting this angle, I went ahead and I cut on the chop saw this angle that you see in here, and this is just cut out of a piece of 1/4-inch MDF, and I double checked the angles again after I cut it, and I marked it 56.2 degrees, wrote dodecahedron on there, and I made this wedge sled. I don't know if you can see it, but it's just like any other wedge sled. I've got my runner here that sits in the groove. I cut that, glued it on, and then I ran it through the table saw so it's perfectly square with the blade here. And then I drew a square line. Move it over here so you can see it. The pencil line here is squared off of that blade, and I used the most accurate square that I had. Then I centered my piece and permanently glued it on there with CA glue. And for the sides, I just used 1-inch MDF. I made sure that they were as close to square as humanly possible, and I glued those on as well. After I did that, I took another piece of 1-inch MDF. I made a cut. It wasn't this piece, I actually think I threw it in the trash over there, but I made my cut, set it on my saw, and triple checked it again, and it was perfect. No light in between the square. It reads exactly 56.2 degrees. It may seem like a lot of effort, but it's really not. It took me about an hour to make this wedge sled from start to finish. And and I would say more than half of that time was just making sure that this angle was perfect. Again, I don't want to have to remake this wedge sled. I don't want it to ever change. I want it to be able to take it off the wall and just use it. And because we are making a sphere, if your angle is off even by 1 degree, by the time you reach the other end of that, you're going to have really bad fit issues. So I take a lot of time in setting up my angles for something like this. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to set our blade for the right angle to cut our triangles, which that angle is going to be 13.12 degrees. I'm going to readjust the camera so that you can see how I'm setting that up on the blade, and then we'll get to cutting these triangles out. Alright, we're ready to set our angle for the sides of the triangle. And I'm going to set it at 13.12 degrees. And I'm going to use my Wixie to do that. Now, my Wixie on this table saw won't read 13.12 degrees, so it would have to be at a different angle. I think it's like that. It would have to be on the other side of the blade. So what I have to do is some real quick, simple math, which is I have to take 90 degrees, and I have to subtract 13.12 degrees from it, and that's basically, I wrote that out wrong, but it's going to be 76.88 degrees is what I'm looking for here on my saw. So I'm going to go ahead and set that real quick, and then we're going to make a test cut, and we'll go from there. But I'm going to zero this Wixie on the side where I will be making the cuts. On this table saw, it's perfectly flat all the way across, but I know some table saws might be slightly different. So if you're going to be cutting on this side, you want to zero your Wixie on that side. If you're going to be cutting on this side, you want to zero your Wixie on this side. So what I'm doing is I set it up, I turned it on, I hit 0, and then I'm going to stick it to the blade here. And I don't know if you guys can see that in the camera or not. Hopefully you can. I'm going to go ahead and adjust it to my 76.88 degrees. Okay, right there I'm at 76.8 degrees, and I'm going to take it off and just double check. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to set it back here, make sure it reads 0, which it does. Then I'm going to place it back on the blade, make sure it reads 76.8. It's, yep, 76.8. It's just an extra step I like to use to make sure that's right. Now that I've got that set, I'm going to go ahead and make a quick cut. And this is just a test cut to check my angle. Lower that blade just a little bit. Always wear your safety glasses. I'm going to readjust the camera real quick and then we'll get back to it. Okay, so I've made my test cut after setting my blade, and how I double check that is I usually will use two separate angle finders. I found that the Wixie is an extremely accurate tool. I really like it, but I always like to follow up with a second one made by a different company and see how close the numbers match. I do have a third angle finder, which is one of those manual ones that just has the really fine angles marked on it, but I found that it's just as accurate as any of these are. So after I cut my piece, which I have here, I'm looking for 76.88 degrees. So when you double check it, it's probably better to be at 79 degrees than at 76.8 degrees, because it's 0.88 degrees. That's almost a whole degree. So that makes a big difference when you're trying to create a spear. So what I've done is I've made my test cut on this side, and now I'm going to check it with my follow-up angle finder. And if I put it up there, you can see on the screen there that I've got 76.9 degrees. So I know my blade is as accurate as it's going to get. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set up to actually start cutting my triangles, and I'm probably going to do a test cut, and then we'll go from there. Alright, at this point I've done a lot of fine tuning. A lot actually happened off camera. It took me about an hour and a half to get everything fine tuned, and I'm kind of going to talk to you about how I did that and what happened. The first thing that I did was I cut some blank pieces. They were just strips roughly 3 inches wide. They were, I don't know, probably about 18 or 19 inches long. And I started cutting my angles. And as I cut my angles, I used tape to pull the test pieces together. And as you can see, I have one of my test pieces here. And this is what it should look like. You should have a gap after you cut your 5 pieces. You should have a gap on one end. And when you pull them together like this, with no effort at all of your seams should be tight. There should be no gaps. You shouldn't be able to see light through them. And if you have to put force on them to make those gaps tighten up, then your glue joints probably aren't going to work out as well as you would like them to. And you can kind of see it in the video if you look close. I'll actually try and zoom in here, see if you can get a better look at it. Readjust this here, get it even closer. Okay, so when I have tape on it, just holding it together. When I pull them together with just the tape on them, this was the very first one that I cut, and you can see there's movement in there. They're not 100% accurate, and we're talking about fractions of a degree at this point. My angle on the side here wasn't quite right by just a little bit, and my angle here wasn't quite right. I actually had to take a little off of each side, and I had to tighten up this angle on the top here. And to give you an idea of how much I put into that, these right here, back this thing up just a little bit. What you see in this trash can are all the test pieces that I did. And there's a lot of them. There's one, there's another, there's some that I taped together, another one. I mean, there's a lot in there. You can see all of the angles that I cut. I probably made roughly 10 of these in order to get my angle exactly right. Move the camera again. Try and get lined up. Okay, there we go. So after all the fine tuning and everything, I'll show you what I ended up doing. Just the camera here. The blade here is the easy part. You just have to adjust your angle a little bit. But I had already made up my sled jet, my wedge sled here, and it's kind of a permanent thing. What I ended up doing was taking a block with some sandpaper attached to it, and I took a little bit off of it at a time, readjusting this angle from point to point until it was a perfect angle. And when I folded them up, there was no effort whatsoever, and the joints lined up perfectly. And here's what it ends up looking like. You can see in the video that those joints are perfectly tight. And I just glued it together with CA glue. I didn't use any clamps. They were just pushed in there, and that's it. And if you were able to hold this in your hand and look at it, you would see that those joints fit exactly perfect. Now you can kind of see a little spot up here where it looks like it doesn't, but that's just a little 1/4 inch, and that was when I was cutting it, I kind of twisted that piece a little bit coming out of the saw. Now the reason that I made such a big one, because the ones that I'm going to make for my actual project are only going to be a triangle about that big. Right there where that line is, about 1 1/4 inches from point to point, 1 1/8 inches. But again, if you do a test piece with a larger angle from here to here, then you're going to be able to dial that in and fine tune that angle a lot easier. So I'm going to go ahead and cut one more test piece just to show you what it looks like. And once I cut that test piece, then I'm going to jump into cutting all the triangles that I need here. Now I'm probably not going to film that. It's just boring. You're just making cut after cut after cut until you've got 120 of them. If you're already doing segmenting, then you already know what that looks like. If you haven't done segmenting before, you're just going to get an idea of it. And again, if you have any questions or if you need a further video later on, just mention it in the comments and I'll be happy to take care of that for you. Let me go ahead and set up to cut this next test piece, and we'll go from there. Alright, what we're going to do now is we're going to set up to start cutting our actual pieces for this project. What we're going to do for that is we're going to take one of our pieces that's actually going to be used for the project, and we're going to make one angled cut on this piece, and then we're going to stop the saw and we're going to set up the saw table with a stop so that we can consistently make each cut. So let's go ahead and make that cut real quick. So I've got my first angle cut here, and this is what we're going to use to set up our stop. We want our stop set up so that our point is the point of our next triangle, is gonna come right off of there, and our triangle should look like that. I'm trying to get this camera to focus, but that might be as good as it gets. So our triangles are going to come out. We're just going to flip it back and forth, and that's why we have the 8.95 degrees on both sides. You know, we can, as we flip it, we'll maintain that 8.95 degree on the bottom side of each triangle as we flip back and forth. So I'm going to set my piece on my sled, my wedge sled here, And I'm going to pull my saw blade over so that I'm right at that point. And then I'm going to pull my, what I'm actually using for my stop is, see if you guys can see that, is a piece of granite. That's a little bit unusual for somebody to use as a stop, I know, but the way that I look at it is you want to use something hard for your actual stop. I'm going to move this back just a little bit and adjust it so that you can kind of see better what's going on here. There we go. So I like to use something hard. You can use a piece of plastic, but I wouldn't use wood. And the reason why is you're going to be cutting 120 of these, and that really sharp point there, every time you push it against a piece of wood or plywood or MDF, is going to dig in a little bit. And after 120, you're going to have a groove cut in here, and your pieces aren't going to be all the same size. I want them all as close to being the same size as humanly possible. In order to do that, I need a stop that's not going to allow my wood to dig in there and change that dimension. So again, I'm going to take a look at that. I'm going to pull it back, and then I'm going to bring my stop up to that piece. Move that. I have and this, just take your time. It only takes a few seconds to get it right where you want it to be. There we go. Lock that in place. I'm actually going to move this back a little bit from the saw itself, and I'm going to take a clamp, and way back here I'm just going to clamp it to my fence. That's just going to keep everything locked in place. It's not going to move now. I can make all of my cuts, and there will be no issue on it. Now, there's one more thing that I have to show you before we get too involved. I'm going to try and focus in here as much as I can. Each cut actually requires 2 cuts, and I'm going to show you what I mean right now. So I've got my first cut, I flipped it over, and I'm getting ready to make cut number 2. I'm going to shut the saw off for a second so that I can show you what's actually going on here. After I made that cut, it actually leaves a little corner up here, and if you're actually doing this project, you'll see what I mean. It leaves a little angle up at the point. So after you make that cut, you have to slide that piece over just a little bit more, make one more cut before you can flip it over and make your angle. So this is what it looks like in real time. Okay, so we're actually getting our pieces cut out finally. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an angled piece here so that my pieces fall away from the saw blade. So I'm going to pause this real quick. I'm going to put that on there, and then we're going to finish, we're going to continue cutting these pieces here. Okay, I'm back, and what I did is I just let me take this camera off the stand here. Is I just built a little ramp on the side of the table saw there. All it is a piece of let's see if I can get this to focus. All it is a piece of 1/8 inch plywood that I put another little piece of 1/2 inch plywood underneath of to give it the angle. And I want a pretty steep angle because I want those pieces to fall away from the blade. I don't want them shooting back at me. They probably wouldn't hurt if they did hit me, but it's just, you know, one less thing to worry about. So I'm going to make a few more cuts here. Let you see what that looks like. And then we'll move on to the next step. I'm going to move this back far enough so that you can kind of see the whole process here. Let me readjust the camera and the focus a little bit so that I'm just a little further back. Alright, here we go. I'm going to cut out several pieces, and then we're going to take a closer look at it. Okay, so you guys can get the idea of what I'm doing there. Now, what I'm going to go ahead and do real quick is I'm going to take some of these things and I'm going to tape them together, and this is really my final check before I just start mass producing these things and cutting them out like at a higher rate of speed here. I'm just going to take a piece of masking tape. Well, any tape will work. And I'm going to take 5 of these and I'm going to tape them together and see what they end up at being. And when you're putting these together, just take the time to make them as accurate as possible. In other words, line the corners up as best as possible. That way when you do fold them together, you're going to get a really good idea of how these things are going to turn out. Sticking to my fingers. Okay. Kind of hard to see, but that's one of my octagons right there, and that's the full size. That's as big as I wanted it to be. I'm gonna measure it real quick and see if I was right. Yeah, the narrowest part is at 2 1/4 inches. The longest points are going to be, I'll measure one real quick. From longest point to longest point, we're at 2 1/2 inches. You probably can't see that very well, but everything looks good. So at this point, what I can do is I can just start cutting them out. Before I jump onto that, because I'm not going to record me cutting out 120 triangles. That's pretty tedious stuff. I'm just going to talk a little bit more, and then I'll get to finishing that up. Okay, so at this point I've walked you through the whole setup and everything, and we've got everything fine-tuned, and we're going to cut our pieces out. I started this part of the filming at about 8 o'clock this morning, and roughly right now it's 3 o'clock. And I haven't even cut all my 120 pieces yet. I just cut my test pieces before I get to doing all the work. That's going to take about an hour to do. So the setup and everything is pretty time consuming. And you have to add in the factor that, you know, I'm trying to film it, so I have to mess with the camera and all that stuff. But on the next one that I decide to make, because I've done all the footwork, because I've figured out all my angles precisely, I've made all the notes, I've made a permanent wedge sled for it, that time's going to be cut down considerably, because there's a lot of focus on getting everything exactly right. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about right now before I finish this video up, is the biggest difference between bad work, good work, great work, and excellent work is the amount of time and effort and energy that you put into getting everything as close to perfect as possible. I could have probably made this dodecahedron a lot faster if I didn't focus as much on getting the angles perfect and all of this and that, but the end product is going to show that I didn't spend that time on it. And I think that that's really where a lot of projects are kind of lacking, is patience, focus on detail, and making sure that everything is as close to perfect as possible before you move on to the next step. So if you're going to take on a project like this, or any project, what's going to set you apart from everybody else out there is how much effort you're willing to put into it. And a lot of people say, I don't have the patience for that. And there is a lot of patience that's involved in the setup, in the glue up, and all of that stuff. But certain aspects of it, you can walk away from it for a while. And I always have more than one project going on at the same time. So the cutting portion of this, it all has to be done at one time. You have to set aside the time to cut all your pieces out and put them in a box. But if you're tired after that, mentally exhausted, whatever it may be, you know, close the box and walk away from it for a few days, work on other projects, and then come back to it when you're ready. And that's probably what I'm going to do here. I'm going to cut all my pieces out, and I'm going to focus on one of my other projects. What it does for me is it allows my brain to reset on this project, because I showed you the trash can full of mistakes, and I ended up having to film plenty of these parts several times over because things weren't quite exactly right. So in order to kind of recover from that and move on to the next step, I'm going to have to take some time away from the project, but it doesn't mean that I'm not working on other stuff. The next video, we're going to glue this thing up, and we're going to talk about how you can do different things to make this project unique to yourself, and I'm going to show you what I'm going to do to make this project unique to me. And that's where the actual art starts to come into play, not the shape itself. I mean, there's a lot going into that, making sure your joints are great and everything, but in the end, even if all my joints are great and perfect, it's just going to be a ball, a dodecahedron. And again, not everybody, but it's been done before, and it's been done a lot of times. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that dodecahedron, that standard shape that has been done, you know, many, many times, and I'm going to turn it into a work of art, and I'm going to add things and pieces to it that are going to make it completely unique to me, so that when somebody sees that ball, that dodecahedron, they're going to know who made it. And I'm going to make sure that in the end they will know who made it, because it's going to have my signature all over it. Not just my actual signature, but it's going to have my style, it's going to have my interpretation, it's going to have my thoughts and my effort. You're going to be able to see that, and everybody's thoughts, efforts, and all of that, it's unique to you as an individual, and you can see that as a signature in the actual piece. And we're going to talk more about that in the next video when we start gluing it up, and we're also going to talk about where we're going to go with this, because the glue up is a video all in itself. There's a lot going on there, but we are going to touch base on what the next step is. It's going to get really interesting after the glue up. And I hope you guys come back to see the glue up and the next steps. This is going to be an ongoing process, and my guesstimate on this before we go is it's going to probably take 150 to 200 hours for this project from start to finish, because there's more than just the spear. I'm going to be doing a finial with it. I'm probably going to be doing a stand, but I'm thinking just the dodecahedron, the spear with the finial is going to be 150 to 200 hours. On top of that will be the stand and all of that stuff. So check back in a couple weeks, maybe a week and a half, 2 weeks, and hopefully I'll have another video ready to go for you. And we'll move on to video number 3. Thanks for checking me out. Also, if you want to see more content and more projects that aren't on YouTube, be sure to follow me on Instagram. It's at Eli Polite. There's a lot of content on there, and I look forward to seeing you there. Thanks for stopping in and checking it out.